If you ever want to get a glimpse into developer intention, try playing a game with self-imposed limitations. You might be surprised how much they can highlight the game's design, the core gameplay loop, elements of balance, and even the game's flaws. The Pokémon Nuzlocke is a perfect example. There are many shades of Nuzlocke with different rules that have game design philosophies all their own. Now that I've played a few Nuzlockes in different games with varying rule sets, I want to take a look at the game design implications of some of the more and less common rules and how they change the way you experience the systems Game Freak designed. I'll be using my recent hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokémon Pearl to do it, along with some details from my other challenge runs. Finally, I'll explain why I think you should try a Nuzlocke. Let's start with the basic rules established in that old webcomic. Rule number 1, you can only capture the first Pokemon you encounter in each new area you explore. The definition of area differs depending on who you talk to. Some say it needs to be linked to an origin marked on the Pokemon. You can see this when looking at an individual Mon's stat screen. Others say it's linked to when the encounter table changes, like how there are multiple different encounter tables for Mount Coronet. The thing is, this rule is inherently flawed, and how flawed it is depends on which game you're playing, especially the early game. The issue is Pokemon availability. For example, if you're playing Red or Blue, it's not crazy unlikely for you to be stuck with 2 or 3 Rattata by the time you reach Pewter City, which is why the community widely adopts the dupe clause, which allows you to skip any evolution line that you've already caught. However, it also forbids you from using duplicate Pokemon, which has a lot of gameplay implications and highlights what I have come to consider the biggest flaw in pre-Gen 7 game design, HMs, but we'll talk about that later. The dupe clause has 2 really important effects on the Nuzlocke experience. First of all, it makes a typical run more or less possible on a consistent basis. I mean, you'd probably be fine without the dupe clause in Hoenn and Sinnoh, but there's a high chance for a lot of struggles in Kanto and Johto. Second of all, it makes for a huge amount of replayability, because the chances of having the same Pokemon in each run is very low. It requires you to think on your feet a lot and use mons you might never normally consider using. Not only that, but metas form around the dupe clause as well. You can target specific Pokemon in future routes by going out of your way to catch ones that frequently spawn. This can feel like a bit of a hack, one that I've used a number of times to great effect. Rule number 2, if a Pokemon faints, you must release it, or just put it in a specified box. It's dead, that's the point. You can't use it anymore. This rule also requires you to think on your feet and makes you consider things that you normally wouldn't in a casual playthrough. I was using an in-game traded Kadabra in Pearl. It reached level 31 during the gym battle with Maylene, but because it was above level 30 and I hadn't earned my 3rd badge, Kadabra wouldn't obey me, and therefore wasted a turn and required me to switch. This was very unexpected and very dangerous. When Permadeath is in play, any mistake can result in a complete and total loss of a Pokemon, which causes ripple effects throughout the rest of the game. With that said, while mistakes can and do happen, most deaths will be the result of a surprise, a crit, a miss, or even a damage calculation that you don't expect. The most dangerous thing is an unexpected trainer battle. These are lovingly referred to as jump scares in the community, and it's a really fitting name because my heart always sinks when they happen. When a Pokemon dies, you have to learn to pivot. How can I fill the hole this Pokemon left? Do I have anything in my PC that can substitute? Are there any upcoming encounters that fill the role? What future battles are going to be harder now that they're gone, and what can I do to make them easier? All these questions pop up, and it takes real planning and strategizing to bounce back, neither of which is ever truly necessary in a casual playthrough of any Pokemon game. Rule number 3? While not part of the original comic, mandatory nicknames is the 3rd and final universally accepted core Nuzlocke rule, and despite being pointless on paper, I actually think it's really important. When dealing with limited Pokemon choice in Permadeath, it's easy to view mons as tools rather than companions. They're a means to an end. Nicknames help abate that, but it's not about making you feel sad when a Pokemon dies or even making you feel terrible when you need to make a sacrifice. It's about the moments. It's about the stories that unfold. There are a number of optional rules that can increase or decrease the difficulty and provide quality of life features for the player. In many cases, it's not a single rule, but combinations of them that can make for a particularly difficult challenge. The party limit rule is pretty simple. Your party is restricted to the number of Pokemon that the boss you're facing has. This is typically limited to gym leaders due to their proximity to a Pokemon Center. This can be extended to other bosses like Cyrus or the rival fights, but this increases the difficulty of the game drastically due to them often being after long gauntlets, which we'll talk about a little later. I followed this rule in my Sapphire Nuzlocke. At first, I didn't think it would have a huge impact. I often don't need to use more than a couple Pokemon on a single gym leader anyway. However, I quickly realized that the party limit rule is a huge spike in difficulty, specifically when things start to go wrong, and even more broadly when RNG comes into play. If you're able to thoroughly plan out and execute a plan to handle a gym leader, you're just fine, and you probably won't notice this rule that much. And honestly, this is what happens most of the time. But if something goes wrong, you have a lot fewer options to try and work around it. A perfect example is Flannery. I had a solid plan, but Attract caused a huge issue. Because 2 out of the 3 Pokemon I used were male, which is another mechanic you never really have to think about in a casual playthrough unless you're breeding, I had to try to rely on Linoone, which couldn't take a full powered overheat and therefore died. If I had a full party of 6, I would have had a lot more options for switching and mitigating damage, and very possibly more female mons to cover for Attract. Much of my Pearl Nuzlocke felt incredibly easy, due solely to the lack of party limits, despite using a hardcore rule set. But if I had used party limits, it would have been a crushingly difficult playthrough. There were so many times when I was switching frequently throughout a battle to avoid deaths, and the obedience issue from earlier could have been run-ending. The next rule is one I actually think should be considered a Nuzlocke staple. The level cap is also a very simple rule. None of the Pokemon in your party can exceed the highest level of the boss you're facing when you initiate the battle. Once again, this is usually limited to gym leaders and the champion, though some do expand it to the Elite Four members. Including other bosses gets very complicated and requires very aggressive XP management. I've used level caps in all of my Nuzlocke so far, but have only limited them to gym leaders and the champion. They're super important because they're really what allow the game to pose a challenge. Theoretically, you could just grind your starter far above the necessary level well before even the first couple badges and sweep the entire game. That's why I think they should be standard. For the record, I also think this of the dupe clause, and it might as well be. Even when matching levels, most gym leaders won't pose a challenge. EV training tilts the scales, and if you're playing gens 1 through 3, you'll have badge boosts, but even disregarding those two things, your planning and preparation will put you at a huge advantage. When you're hitting with super effective stab bonuses, you're probably going to 1 or 2 shot just about everything. But the cases of 2 shots are relevant because 1 HP is infinitely more than 0 when any one thing going wrong can cost you a Pokemon. Looking at Pearl, Badoo swept Roark, Staravia swept Gardenia, and it wasn't until Maylene that I had any semblance of trouble, and that was only because of the aforementioned obedience issue. Crasher Wake was a little tougher, but that's because my Luxio died in a really stupid way, which happens. Basically, every gym leader was swept by 1 or 2 Pokemon, and those that needed more sophisticated strategies weren't as threatening as I thought they would be. Depending on the game, the champion is a different story, but unless we're talking Johto, that's also the end of the game, and therefore deaths can be used for safe switch-ins and more reckless, aggressive play. But it's more than just the difficulty of the boss battles. To an extent, level caps keep the rest of the game relevant. XP management becomes a factor, which is particularly difficult when accounting for longer gauntlets like Galactic HQ or Mount Coronet. Unless you're using lots of restoratives, repels, or running back to the Pokemon Center frequently, gauntlets are already the toughest parts of most older Pokemon games. This is amplified in a Nuzlocke, and even more so when level caps are a factor. Not to mention, a lot can go wrong in a gauntlet, which can snowball out of control. Level caps don't so much increase the difficulty as require it, aside from Cynthia in the case of Diamond and Pearl. My run actually ended at Lucian, but I went back in just to get some footage of Cynthia, and even with my team at level 80, and it still wasn't a free fight. Though I only had 5 Pokemon and it was in set mode and I wasn't using items, still, it wasn't as free as I expected. Doing so with proper level caps would have been quite hard. Set mode is another common rule among Nuzlockes. For those who don't know, shift in set mode is an in-game option. It's kinda weird in its placement because it's really a difficulty setting, and yet they refer to it as battle styles. I only mention this because prior to starting this retrospective series with Red and Blue, I didn't know about this. Shift mode allows you to freely switch your Pokemon after defeating an opponent's Mon and is the default. Set mode does not allow that. It's a very small change that has a big impact. Every game's AI is a little different and has some weird interactions, but generally you can expect the opponent to send out a Pokemon that is strong in one way or another against yours. The ability to switch in response for free is incredibly powerful. If the opponent is sending in a Pokemon that is strong against yours, you can just switch to a Pokemon that is strong against the one that's being switched in. Without this ability, you have to consider switching out or risking a feint, and switching gives the opponent a free turn. Even then, you'll likely never encounter an issue with set mode in a casual playthrough, other than at the champion. Set mode is higher difficulty, there's no argument against that, but that doesn't mean it's really hard. The default setting is shift mode, but I really think it should be set mode, with shift as an option to bring the difficulty down rather than up. I've used set mode for every Pokemon game since I learned about it, and I won't go back, and this is certainly the case for Nuzlocke. It might as well already be a required rule anyway. I want to rapid fire a few other minor rules that can be pretty impactful in combination with others. Some people restrict the use of repels because they are very powerful in a Nuzlocke. Not only do they allow you to avoid random encounters whenever you want to, which reduces the risk of something going wrong and makes XP management easier, it also allows you to target specific Pokemon, namely legendaries. I did this in my Sapphire run. I used repels to guarantee Kyogre for my Cave of Origin encounter. Now, I didn't actually have to do this because you can't encounter any other Pokemon before Kyogre, but I didn't know that at the time. But that's if you allow for legendaries in the first place. Some people don't because of how powerful they are, or mythicals, but you usually can't encounter those at all before the end of the game. However, I personally think legendaries should be handled on a case-by-case basis. I used Ho-Oh in my Gold Nuzlocke, which was very powerful, but not quite as powerful as I thought it would be. It was very useful, and I probably wouldn't use it again, but it didn't make or break the run in any particular way, and it actually died to an Executor. I used Kyogre in my Sapphire Nuzlocke, which was far too powerful. I didn't realize just how broken it would be at the time. Pokemon is a game of numbers, and Kyogre has a lot of numbers. I chose not to use Palkia in my Pearl run, and I'm glad I didn't, because I probably would have won simply on its shoulders. It has 680 base stats, and nothing in the Elite Four or on Cynthia's team can really compare. But what about Uxie, Azelf, and Mesprit? They all have base stats of 580, and their movesets are fine? Nothing super special and wouldn't impact the run much, so using one of them might not be so bad. In somewhat the same vein as Repel Usage, skipping trainers is another rule that can have a big impact. If you require fighting all trainers, at least the ones that are in your direct path, it makes XP management much more difficult and can be really dangerous. But it's absolutely a challenge many people take up. I did so in both Gold and Sapphire, but not in Pearl. However, skipping trainers is totally valid. It's actually kind of fun because it's a bit of a mini game in and of itself. Some trainers are very scary, especially the double battles. There's one particular double battle on Route 210 that has a Raichu and a Gyarados, a dangerous combination. But you can skip them if you pay attention to their movement, which admittedly was pretty hard for me because of... HMs are bad design. That's the opinion I've come to after playing all of Gens 1, 2, and 3, and now Pearl, and it was made all the clearer by my time playing Nuzlocke challenges due primarily to the two core rules, one Pokémon Per Route along with the Dupe Clause, and Permadeath. The original concept behind them is solid and is easily inferred just from playing the game. The developers wanted to strengthen the connection you have to your Pokémon and make it feel like you're going on an adventure with them. They also encourage, if not require, you to vary your team choices. I'll be talking with Diamond and Pearl in mind for this section. You need a Pokemon that can learn Surf and Waterfall. You need a Pokemon that can learn Cut. You need a Pokemon that can learn Rock Smash, Strength, and Rock Climb, and while you don't need a Pokemon that can learn Fly and Defog, the game is seriously annoying if you don't. Particularly Defog. Not only does it make attempting to skip trainers much harder, it also decreases accuracy on all moves, both yours and your opponent's, which can make for some very dangerous RNG situations. I think it's evidence enough of HM's poor design that Game Freak eventually decided to do away with them. They require certain roles to be filled in team building, which isn't really a big problem in a casual playthrough. The developers didn't balance around you being restricted to one Pokemon per route, but in a Nuzlocke where you are not guaranteed any one type of Mon, it can be a point of significant frustration. And it highlights which types of Pokemon are and are not available in any given region. For me, it's always either the water type or the flying type. In Sapphire, my Wingull died early on, and I straight up could not catch another Pokemon that could use Fly. In Pearl, it was flying again. After my Staravia died, I had to hunt for a Wingull. Thankfully, I was able to find one, particularly relevant because of defog. Speaking of which, HMs wouldn't be so bad if most didn't totally suck. Why is defog a move? It has such niche uses in battle. Cut, Rock Smash, Rock Climb, they're all garbage. Surf and Waterfall are okay, but the former is a special move and the latter is physical, so one of the moves is going to be pretty inefficient for most Pokemon choices, unless you plan to have multiple water types on your team, which limits coverage. Strength, at least, is a decent move. That's 8 moves that are more or less required for your team. That's 2 whole Pokemon, 33% of them, taken up by HMs. A significant problem in a Nuzlocke, but still annoying even in a casual playthrough. And what happens if a particular Pokemon dies and you don't have any others that can fill the role? Well, there is a pretty simple solution, and that's what the HM rule is, using dead Pokemon for HMs. You can't use them in battle, and you can't teach them any moves, but at least you can progress in the game. You need to sacrifice a slot most of the time though. I've never done this, but it's an option. Anyway, HMs are bad design. That's all there is to it. So, rare candies. I want to make something clear right off the bat. This is a solved issue. It is totally acceptable to use infinite rare candies in your Nuzlocke runs, but choosing which rules to use for a Nuzlocke is about choosing which rules would be the most fun. And I have the most fun in Nuzlockes with infinite rare candies. But they have gameplay implications that go beyond just whether they're a handicap or not. So the question is, are they a handicap? Yes, they are. There's no question, at least if you're doing an official Pokemon game. ROM hacks are a different matter. On paper, all they save you is time. Lots and lots and lots of time. I didn't use infinite rare candies in my gold Nuzlocke. When I lost a Pokemon or needed to replace one, I grinded it out. It got a little more bearable when I found the XP share, but it still took a very long time. And it wasn't always completely safe. I had to be careful not to let one of my Pokemon faint. It wasn't like I could just turn my brain off completely and watch YouTube. But it had another effect too. The first time I whited out was on Red, the end of the Nuzlocke. I had plenty of Pokemon and it wasn't a hardcore run. I could have rebuilt a team to try again, but I lost all motivation because the thought of grinding out an entire team to even just the 50s, much less 65 plus, sounded horrible. So in reality, I didn't properly lose my gold Nuzlocke. I gave up. In both Sapphire and Pearl, I used infinite rare candies, and it was so much more fun. Losing Pokemon still hurt big time, but it then became a puzzle of figuring out what other mons I had, which I could get, and using them strategically. I didn't need to rely on my core team for every battle. I could build specific teams for each one. I intentionally built unique teams for every single gym leader in both Sapphire and Pearl, and it was so satisfying, especially when a strategy worked perfectly. Rare candies don't just save you time, they save you motivation as well, and Game Freak knows it. Why do you think modern Pokemon games have XP candies? There is one very minor drawback though. It does deprive your Pokemon of EV training, at least to an extent, which can make a difference in very niche circumstances, but probably won't be relevant in an official Pokemon game. Even so, if you're using infinite rare candies, you really do need to be using level caps as well, unless you want to sweep the entire game with level 100s, but hey, you do you. It's your Nuzlocke. As I've mentioned, I did a hardcore Nuzlocke for my Pearl run. In addition to the basic rules, hardcore variants also require level caps and 2 additional rules. Probably the most famous and most impactful rule is the restriction of consumable items in battle aside from held items. It's deceptively insidious because the fact of the matter is you're probably not going to use that many items even in a casual playthrough. But when things do go wrong and an item would be warranted, you realize just how powerful they are. Let's think about moves like Recovery or Synthesis for a moment. In a casual playthrough, there really isn't a reason to even learn either of them. They take up a move slot, and even when a Pokemon does know one, why would you use it if you can just use a restorative? But if you can't use items, there are very few ways to consistently and meaningfully restore a Pokemon's health mid-battle, so the value of those moves increases. They're not particularly common outside of the grass type either. Moves like Giga Drain, Leech Seed, Drain Punch, and others can be very powerful in a hardcore Nuzlocke because otherwise damage is permanent until the battle is over unless you use a berry or an item like Leftovers, which usually isn't available early on. Which is a real problem because your options are limited. You can switch, potentially risking another Pokemon, or you can risk the Mon that's already out. If you were to combine the item restriction rule with party limits, the Nuzlocke spikes in difficulty on an exponential scale, because then you have even fewer options and a lot less effective health to work with. When things go wrong, they go very wrong. Due to that, you start to get a sense of the game's AI, which is a little different for each version and are often very RNG heavy. For example, I lost my Gyarados at Bertha in the Elite Four. I had Torterra out and needed to switch out against her Hippowdon. Because Torterra is grass ground, I assumed Hippowdon wouldn't use Stone Edge because it would have been resisted. It knows both Crunch and Earthquake, which would have inflicted normal damage, and it could have always used Curse as well. So I switched to Gyarados in hopes of surviving a Crunch or avoiding Earthquake damage altogether, but Hippowdon used Stone Edge anyway and one-shot Gyarados. And I don't really know why. I don't know if it was random, if the AI just didn't see a kill with the other two moves, I just don't know. It's something I would need more practice, more playthroughs to get down. Or I could just look up a guide, but that's not how I choose to experience these games. A guide for the AI, I mean. When stuff like this happens, it tends to start a snowball. In this case, it was a very direct through line. Gyarados was really my only answer to Cynthia's Garchomp. It was strong and knew Ice Fang, but I no longer had it. Therefore, Cynthia would be much more difficult. I was able to teach Blizzard to Pelipper, but it's not nearly as powerful as Gyarados, and Blizzard is inaccurate. I didn't even get that far though, because Gyarados was also my best answer to Lucian through sheer stats alone. The rest of my team was highly unsuited for Lucian, especially his Bronzong. But even that was the result of a snowball that started all the way back in Pastoria City when I lost Staravia, because if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have needed Pelipper in the first place, and I could have included a Pokemon that fit my Elite Four needs better due to Staraptor covering other matchups. This got a little off track, but I assure you, restricting items is one of the most effective ways of increasing difficulty in a Pokemon game. Even if you were to try a casual playthrough without items, you'd see a significant increase in challenge. The only other rule is that if you white out, it's game over. You need to start a new file for it to be considered a hardcore Nuzlocke. No second chances. I finished off Cynthia just to collect footage, but the Nuzlocke ended with Lucian. So now that we've gone over the rules I have experience with, there are a ton more, let's talk about why you should try a Nuzlocke. Pokemon games are easy. Of course they are. They need to be accessible to players of all ages and abilities. There are tons of built-in features to achieve that accessibility, but the systems that drive the games are actually very complex, and the farther back in the series you go, the more obscure they are. EVs and IVs, prior to Gen 4 physical and special types, and many others. With all the powerful options that Pokemon games give you, restricting even just one or two of them can make that complexity shine. It's very satisfying to recognize the thought Game Freak put into these games because the potential for genuine challenge is in every single one, especially the older generations. You just need to look at the Battle Frontier in Emerald to see evidence of that. The developers just included options to reduce the difficulty in the form of basic mechanics. And when you try a Nuzlocke, you realize just how replayable they are. It's extremely unlikely that any two Nuzlockes are going to be the same, or even particularly similar. Different encounters and crucial moments, like unexpected deaths, or unexpected survivals, or clutch critical hits. The Nuzlocke takes an already highly replayable series and amplifies it, and I haven't even spoken about the many ROM hacks that have taken Nuzlocke rules and used them to fuel their game design. Maybe I'll try one someday. But if you do try a Nuzlocke, keep in mind that it's a very different feeling from a casual playthrough. The difficulty is front-loaded and back-loaded. In the early game, you have very few options and any deaths are really painful. By the mid-game though, you'll likely feel very strong and long-term planning and preparation becomes the game, aside from the occasional tough battle. But the Elite Four and Champion are always looming in the distance, and there's so much to plan and account for that the difficulty spikes significantly right at the end, just as it should. And finally, give Infinite Rare Candies a try. They really help show how much meaningful choice Pokemon games have. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. While this has been a broad look at Nuzlocke design, I haven't forgotten that it's part of my Pokemon Retrospective and Analysis series. My next video will be on Platinum and will focus on the Gen 4 Sinnoh games themselves. But before I go, I am once again asking you to check out the Pokemon Adventures manga. The Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum characters are my favorite of the whole series, and it adapts the story extremely well. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Let me know if you plan to try a Nuzlocke in the comments, and please consider liking and subscribing if you've enjoyed this. On screen is another analysis video that you might like, and a playlist if you're interested. Please consider checking them out. Thank you so much for watching.